The hallway was long and white. It smelled like cold metal and recycled air, the way every building in the GCA Earth Integration Division always smelled. Junho walked through it every morning with his research bag on his shoulder and a cup of coffee in his hand. He was not a tall man. He was not a loud man. He did not walk like someone who wanted to be noticed. He walked like someone who had a lot of thinking to do and not enough time to do it. He was 31 years old. So he had 2 published papers on xenobiology, 1 commendation from a VETH science board that most humans had never heard of, and a small desk near the back of the research floor where the light flickered every afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock. He had reported the flickering light 14 times. Nobody had fixed it. He kept working anyway. That was the kind of man Yunho was. The year was 2041. 3 years had passed since the Galactic Convergence Alliance made contact with Earth, and the world had changed in ways that were hard to explain. There were alien ships in orbit. There were alien officials in government buildings. There were new rules, new languages, new hierarchies. And somewhere at the top of all of it, there was a clear and quiet message that most humans understood without anyone saying it directly. Humanity was the new species. Humanity was the small one. Humanity was tolerated. Most alien civilizations did not hate humans. They simply did not think much of them. Humans were emotional. Humans were messy. Humans made decisions based on feelings rather than data. Humans cried at things that had no survival value. Humans formed attachments that slowed them down. To most of the GCI, these were not qualities. These were problems. Junho had heard this his whole career. He had heard it in review meetings and conference rooms, and in the quiet looks alien colleagues gave each other when he spoke. He did not argue. But he did not explain himself. He just went back to his desk and worked. Yura sat 3 floors above him. She was 30 years old, sharp in the way a clean blade is sharp, and she had worked harder than almost anyone Junho had ever met. She had learned 2 alien languages in 18 months. She had passed every GCA diplomatic certification on the first try. She dressed and spoke and carried herself in a way that made it clear she was not interested in being seen as limited. However, she wanted the aliens in those buildings to look at her and see an equal. She had decided a long time ago that the fastest way to do that was to stop being too human. Junho had known her for 4 years. They had worked in the same division, crossed paths in the same corridors, eaten lunch in the same cafeteria more times than either of them had counted. He had watched her with the quiet attention of someone who notices everything but says very little. He knew she took her coffee without sugar, and he knew she read mission reports twice before responding to them. He knew she laughed more than she let people see, and that she did it quickly, like she was embarrassed by it. He had been in love with her for 2 of those 4 years. He had not said anything because he was not the kind of man who spoke before he was ready. But one evening in late autumn, after a long day and a longer meeting, he found himself walking beside her toward the elevator, and he thought, simply and clearly, that if he did not say it now, he never would. So he said it. He did not make a speech. He did not prepare anything. He told her that he had admired her for a long time, that he thought she was one of the most genuine people he had ever known, even when she was trying very hard not to be, and that he would very much like to spend more time with her if she was open to it. She stopped walking. Ak told him, in the calm tone of someone told him, in the calm tone of someone stating a fact, that she had no interest in that kind of connection, not with someone like him. He was, she said, too emotional, too attached to small things, too comfortable being ordinary. She was trying to build something in this new world, and she needed to be around people who were going somewhere. She did not say it cruelly. She said it the way someone pulls off a bandage, quickly, because they believe that is kinder. Then she stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Junho stood in the hallway for a moment. He did not move. He looked at the closed elevator doors, the way someone looks at a thing they have accepted but not yet finished accepting. Daeho was leaning against the wall nearby. He was Junho's oldest friend, broad-shouldered, loud when he was comfortable, and entirely loyal. He had been waiting to walk with Junho to the parking level. He had heard everything. He said nothing at first. He just walked over and put one hand on Junho's shoulder. Junho looked at him. He did not look broken. He looked like a man who had just been given information he needed to have. He said, said quietly. Then I'll give her a reason to be wrong. Daeho did not laugh. He nodded slowly because he knew Junho well enough to know that this was not something said out of anger. It was not a threat. It was not pride. It was just the plain and honest truth of a man who had decided something. They walked to the parking level. They did not talk about it again that night. In the weeks that followed, Junho worked. He worked in the mornings and he worked in the evenings. He read everything the GCA had published about xenobiological classification. He wrote requests to access research databases that humans were not typically given access to. 3 of the requests were denied. He rewrote them with better justification and sent them again. 2 were approved. The flickering light above his desk continued to flicker every afternoon at 3 o'clock. He kept working under it. He also began preparing an application, one that had been sitting in a folder on his computer for 6 months. A posting on Helix 9, a research station at the edge of GCA mapped space. It was understaffed, underfunded, and largely ignored by the scientific community. The assignment was 3 years long. The pay was modest. The conditions were difficult. Nobody wanted to go. Junho submitted his application on a quiet Tuesday morning. He drank his coffee. He looked at the flickering light, and he thought about a closed elevator door and a woman who had looked at him and seen something small. He thought, we will see. Then he opened his next research file and got back to work. It sat at the outer edge of GCA map space, like something that had been placed there and then forgotten. The station was old. Its corridors were narrow and the walls carried the kind of deep cold that did not go away no matter how high the heating was set. The observation windows were scratched. Well, half the equipment in the biology lab was outdated by at least a decade. The food supply was limited to what the quarterly resupply ship brought, which was never quite enough and never quite good. Junho arrived in the first week of January 2042 with 2 duffel bags, a crate of research equipment he had packed himself, and a small jar of instant coffee that he had learned the station did not stock. He looked around his assigned quarters. A room barely large enough for a bed, a desk, and a narrow shelf. And he put his bags down and he thought, good, no distractions. The crew of Helix 9 was small, 11 alien researchers and 1 human. The alien crew belonged to 3 different species: the tall, pale-skinned Veth, the broad and four-armed Doran, and a single Cellin scientist named Orek, who barely spoke to anyone and spent most of his time in the upper observation deck. None of them were unfriendly, but none of them were welcoming either. And that was, after all, what humans usually do. That was, after all, what humans usually did in GCA science postings. Junho did not stay out of the way. On his 3rd day, he asked the lead Veth researcher, a thin and precise woman named Vel, if he could review the station's existing biological data on the plant-like organisms they had been cataloging in the nearby asteroid belt. Vel looked at him for a long moment, and then she handed him a data tablet and said nothing. Junho spent the next 4 days reading. He read everything: the original survey data, the growth pattern records, the failed classification attempts. He read the notes the previous researchers had left. He drank coffee and made small marks on a notepad and sat with his elbows on his desk and thought. On the 5th day, he went back to Vel. He told her that the organisms were not growing randomly. He told her there was a pattern, not in the data the sensors were collecting, but in the gaps between the data. The organisms were responding to something the sensors were not designed to measure. They were not following chemical signals. They were following something older and quieter, something that changed based on the stress of nearby biological systems, something that, in simple terms, could only be described as feeling. Vel looked at him the way someone looks at a person who has said something either very stupid or very important, and they have not yet decided which. She asked him to show her. He showed her. It took 3 weeks of additional observation and 2 new sensor modifications that Junho built himself from parts he found in the station's storage room. But the data came back exactly as he had predicted. The organisms were, in a way that could be measured and repeated and verified, responding to biological emotional signatures. Nobody on the station had ever seen anything like it. Vel said very little, but the next morning she left a fresh cup of something hot and dark on Junho's desk before he woke up. It was not coffee, but the gesture was the same. That was how it began. Over the next 2 years, Junho developed what would later be called the Junho resonance method. It was a framework for biological analysis that combined standard quantum data mapping with something that had no official scientific name: human intuition. The ability to sit with incomplete information and feel the shape of what was missing. The ability to look at a pattern and know something was wrong before the numbers said so. The ability to care about a problem deeply enough that the mind kept working on it even in sleep. Alien science had no real category for this. Their systems were built on logic and data. They had never needed to account for the fact that sometimes the most important variable in an equation was the emotional state of the person reading it. Junho did not explain this philosophically. He just worked. He published his findings in 3 internal GCA research papers. He answered questions. He showed his process. He let the results speak. Daiho messaged him every few weeks. Oh, the messages were long and warm and full of news from Earth. New GCA policies, new alien cultural exhibits, the small ordinary details of a city adjusting to a very large change, and sometimes casually, in the middle of a paragraph about something else entirely, Daiho would mention Yura. She had been promoted. She was now a senior cultural liaison. She had given a speech at a GCA assembly event that had been covered by 3 interstellar news outlets. She was doing exactly what she had said she wanted to do. Junho read these parts of Daiho's messages the same way he read everything, carefully without rushing. He did not feel bitter. He did not feel angry. He felt something quieter than that, a kind of patience that had moved past waiting and become simply living. He sent Daiho replies that were shorter but just as warm. He told him about the organisms in the asteroid belt. He told him about the scratched observation windows and the bad food and the cold that never left the walls. He told him that Vel had, on one occasion, almost smiled at something he said, which he considered a significant professional achievement. Daiho always wrote back with the same line at the end: "Come home soon, but finish what you started first." In the 3rd year, something changed on the station. It was not dramatic. It happened the way most real changes happen: slowly, and then all at once. The alien crew began including Junho in conversations they had previously held without him. Orek, the Selin scientist who had not spoken more than 12 words to anyone in 2 years, came down from the observation deck one evening and sat across from Junho at dinner and asked him a question about emotional resonance in non-carbon life. They talked for 3 hours. Vel published a joint paper with Junho. She listed his name first. Now, on the last night before the resupply ship came to take Junho back to Earth, the crew gathered in the small common room. There was no party. There was no speech. But they were all there, which said something. Orek brought a bottle of something that was not alcohol but had a similar warmth. Vel sat across from Junho and looked at him in that careful Veth way and said, "You think like no species I have encountered." Junho looked at his cup. "I think like a human," he said. "Hana, we've been doing it for a long time. People just weren't paying attention." Nobody laughed, nobody argued. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something true has been said and everyone in the room knows it. Junho flew home the next morning. He looked out the window of the transport ship as Helix 9 disappeared into the dark. He was 34 years old. As he had 2 duffel bags and an empty jar of instant coffee and a body of work that no one on Earth had fully read yet. He also had the quiet, steady feeling of a man who was only just getting started. Nobody had a good name for it at first. The early reports called it an anomaly, then a biological event, then a crisis. By the time the GCA Assembly used the word threat in an official statement, 14 star systems had already gone dark, and 2 GCA monitoring fleets had pulled back in retreat. Not because they were beaten in battle, because there was nothing to fight. The thing that was spreading through the vile corridor did not carry weapons. It did not send signals or demand surrender. It did not have a fleet or a command structure or a home planet that could be reasoned with or destroyed. It was alive, that much the scientists agreed on, but it was alive in a way that did not fit into any category the GCA had built. They called it the vile bloom. It moved like a tide. It consumed the energy of star systems slowly, methodically, the way a living thing consumes food. It did not kill civilizations outright. It simply surrounded them, cut off their power, their communications. their ability to move. And then it kept growing. Every species that had tried to fight it found the same result. Weapons made it grow faster. Aggression made it spread wider. The harder the GCA pushed, the larger the bloom became. And the GCA's best scientific minds had been working on the problem for 4 months. They had run 10,000 simulations. They had deployed 6 experimental countermeasures. Every single one had failed. Not failed slowly, failed immediately, and made things worse. Commander Riva led the crisis response fleet. She was Veth, tall and pale-skinned and precise in the way that her species valued above almost everything else. She had commanded fleets in 2 previous conflicts, and she had never lost. She was not accustomed to looking at a problem and not finding the logical solution. She was not accustomed to fear, but standing on the bridge of her command vessel and watching the latest simulation show the bloom consuming another monitoring station, she felt something that was very close to it. Her science advisors had given her nothing useful in 4 months. She needed a different kind of thinking. One of her junior analysts, on a young Doran named Ket who had been quietly going through every GCA research archive he could access, found a paper, then 2 more, then a third. They were all written by the same author, a human named Junho, posted to a station called Helix 9. The papers were about biological resonance patterns in non-standard life forms. They were about organisms that responded to emotional signatures. They described a method, the Junho resonance method, that used human intuition alongside data modeling to identify growth patterns that standard systems missed. Ket brought the papers to Commander Riva at midnight. She read them in 2 hours. Then she read them again. At 3 in the morning, she sent a direct request to the GCA Earth Integration Division. She needed Junho on her ship. She needed him in the next 48 hours. Junho was back on Earth by then. Ace did not flicker. Reviewing his Helix 9 did not flicker. Reviewing his Helix 9 data and preparing a full publication. Deho had finally gotten him to go out to dinner twice. He had not seen Yura since he returned. He had not looked for her. The message from Commander Riva arrived on a Thursday morning. Junho read it once. He called Deho. "I have to go," he said. Deho was quiet for a moment. "So how long?" "I don't know." "Is it dangerous?" Junho thought about the Vielle Bloom data that had been included in Riva's message. He thought about the simulation numbers. He thought about 14 dark star systems. "Yes," he said honestly. "Probably." Deho was quiet again. Then, "I'm coming with you." Junho started to argue. Deho had already started making calls. 2 days later, they were both on a transport vessel heading toward the crisis fleet. Deho had used 4 favors and one very loud conversation with a GCA logistics supervisor to get himself assigned as a support engineer. Junho sat next to him on the transport and drank bad coffee and read every report on the Vielle Bloom that existed. The alien officers on Commander Riva's vessel did not hide their feelings about a human joining the crisis table. They were polite in the careful alien way that politeness and condescension can sound identical. But 2 of the senior science advisors asked Riva privately whether this was truly necessary. She told them that their methods had produced nothing in 4 months and that she was open to suggestions. They said nothing. Junho was brought to the main science room. He was given access to all the data. Commander Riva stood at the edge of the room and watched him. He sat down at the central table. He looked at the data feeds. He looked at the simulation records. And he looked at the response patterns from every failed countermeasure. He asked for coffee. A junior crew member brought him something that was not coffee, but was hot and dark. He drank it without comment and kept reading. 6 hours passed. The alien advisors grew impatient. One of them, a senior Doran named Prat, told Riva quietly that the human had been staring at data for 6 hours and produced nothing, which was precisely what he had expected. At the 6-hour mark, Junho stood up, but he looked at Commander Riva. He said calmly and without hesitation, "It's not attacking, it's grieving, and you've been shooting at it." The room went very still. Prat said this was not a scientific conclusion. He said grief was a biological response of social organisms, and there was no evidence this entity had any social structure. Junho turned to look at the simulation data on the screen behind him. He pointed to the growth acceleration patterns that followed each military engagement. When he walked them through the data the way he had once walked Vel through the asteroid belt organisms, step by step, without rushing, letting the numbers do the talking. The bloom did not grow faster when it was winning. It grew faster when it was hit. It grew faster when it was surrounded. It grew faster the more force that was used against it. It was not adapting to survive. It was expanding the way a wounded thing expands, outward, blindly. Because it was in pain and it did not know what else to do. Commander Riva listened to everything. She asked 2 questions. Junho answered both of them clearly. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "What do you need?" Junho told her. He needed materials from the biology lab. He needed access to the station's resonance array. He needed 48 hours, and he needed to go in himself. Pratt objected loudly. Commander Riva raised one hand, and he stopped. She looked at Junho. And she said, 48 hours. Junho nodded. He picked up his notepad and walked toward the biology lab. At the door, he stopped and looked back at the room full of alien scientists who were still staring at him. Some doubtful, some confused, some with expressions he could not fully read. He said nothing. He went to work. He built the probe in 31 hours. He did not sleep. A fade into the background of something more. Fade into the background of something more important. Deho brought him food twice. Both times it sat untouched until it was cold. The third time, Deho sat down and watched him until Junho ate. "You don't have to go in yourself," Deho said. Junho took a bite of whatever the food was, something soft and warm that the ship's kitchen produced without much creativity. He chewed. He thought. He said, "The probe needs a human emotional signature to transmit the resonance pattern correctly. The signal has to be genuine. It can't be programmed." "What does that mean exactly?" Junho looked at him. "It means whatever I send into the bloom has to feel real, not simulated. The organism responds to actual biological emotional output. And if I put an automated system in there, it'll read it as empty and it won't respond." Deho was quiet. "And what exactly are you planning to feel?" he asked carefully. Junho thought about it for a moment. Then he said simply, "Sorry." Deho stared at him. "I'm going to apologize to it," Junho said, as if this was a perfectly normal sentence. "On behalf of everyone who shot at it." Deho put his head in his hands. "You are the strangest man I have ever known." "You keep saying that," Junho said. Dewen went back to work. The probe was not large. It was roughly the size of a transport pod, big enough for one person, equipped with the resonance emitter Junho had built, using the station's array components, and 3 parts he had reconstructed from memory based on his Helix 9 work. The emitter was designed to broadcast biological emotional signatures outward in a pattern that matched the frequency of the bloom's own internal signals. The ones Junho had identified in the data, the ones the alien scientists had classified as noise. It was not noise. It was a voice. A very old, very large, very frightened voice. Commander Riva reviewed the probe design personally. She asked her senior engineer to evaluate it. The engineer said the construction was solid. She asked Pratt if there was a scientific argument against the attempt. Pratt said there was no scientific argument for it either. Riva looked at him for a long moment. Then she approved the mission. The night before, Deho found Junho standing at one of the ship's small viewports, looking out at the edge of the bloom. From this distance, it looked almost beautiful. A vast and shifting cloud of dark biological matter that caught the light of distant stars and scattered it in strange directions. It did not look like something grieving. But grief, Junho had always thought, rarely looked the way people expected it to. "Are you scared?" Deho asked. Junho considered the question honestly. "A little," he said. "Yeah, but mostly I just want to get it right." Deho stood next to him. They were quiet together for a while. "She's been on 3 news channels this month," Deho said eventually. He did not say who. He did not need to. Junho kept looking at the bloom. "I know," he said. "You don't think about her anymore?" Junho was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think about her sometimes, but not the way I used to." He paused. "I used to think about her and feel like something was missing. And now I think about her and I just feel like the story isn't finished yet." Deho looked at him. "That's either very wise or very stubborn." Junho almost smiled. "Probably both." In the morning, Junho climbed into the probe. The crew watched from the bridge. Commander Riva stood at the front of the observation deck with her hands behind her back. Pratt stood to her left and said nothing. The junior crew members, Doran, Beth, Axelan, stood in a loose line and watched the small pod separate from the ship and move slowly toward the edge of the bloom. Deho watched from the engineering bay, his arms crossed so tightly across his chest that his knuckles were pale. He watched the signal tracker on the screen next to him. As long as the signal was there, Junho was there. The probe entered the outer membrane of the bloom. Every sensor went dark, not gradually, instantly. One moment there was data, position, signal, the same. Commander Riva's expression did the same. Commander Riva's expression did not change. She kept her eyes on the space where the probe had been. 11 minutes passed. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Pratt opened his mouth once, and Riva looked at him, and he closed it again. Daiho stared at the flat line on his screen. He pressed his fingers against it as if that would help. Did not happen with a flash, or a signal, 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 or a did not happen with a flash or a signal or an alarm. It happened the way the bloom itself moved, slowly and then all at once. The outer edge of the biological mass, which had been pressing steadily toward the crisis fleet's position, simply stopped. No announcement, no signal. It stopped the way a breath stops when something unexpected happens. And then, slowly, measurably, verifiably on every sensor the ship had, it began to pull back. Not retreat exactly, more like a tide going out. The vast dark mass reorganizing itself, pulling inward, moving away from the inhabited systems it had been pressing toward for months. 3 seconds later, the probe signal came back. Daiho exhaled so hard he had to grab the edge of the console to stay upright. The probe was recovered 12 minutes later. When the hatch opened, Junyo stepped out and sat down on the floor of the bay because his legs were not entirely cooperating. He was pale. He was shaking, not violently but steadily, the way a person shakes when they have been holding something very large and have just set it down. There were tears on his face. He did not appear to have noticed them. The alien crew on the bridge had followed Commander Riva down to the bay. They stood in a loose group and looked at him. Riva crouched down in front of him. She studied his face the way her species studied things, carefully without rushing. "What did you do?" she asked. Junho looked at her. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He took a slow breath. "I told it we were sorry," he said. "I meant it. Apparently that was enough." The bay was completely silent. Commander Riva straightened up. She looked at her crew. Every one of them, Doran, Veth, Selenia was standing still with the particular stillness that comes not from training, but from feeling something you do not have a word for. Daeho put his hand on Junho's shoulder and gripped it hard. Junho reached up and put his hand over Daeho's. They stayed like that for a moment, in the middle of a ship full of alien species who had just watched a human apologize to something the size of a star system, and somehow, impossibly, been heard. The Vial Bloom continued its slow retreat for the next 72 hours. When the GCA monitoring stations confirmed that 14 star systems had been fully released and the biological mass was dissipating at a measurable rate, Commander Riva filed her official report. Under the field marked primary resolution method, she wrote 2 words: human empathy. The report was transmitted to the GCA assembly the same day. By the following morning, every major GCA news channel had the story. By the afternoon, the name Junho was being spoken in places he had never been, and by species who had never given a human a second thought. The event was logged in GCA official records as the Veil Accord. Species credited human. Junho slept through most of the news coverage. He was very tired. Fame, Junho discovered, was mostly just noise. It was messages he did not have time to read, and meetings he had not asked for, and people saying his name in tones that made him feel like they were talking about someone else. He would sit in a briefing room and hear the words "the human who stopped the bloom," and he would look around the room to see who they meant before realizing, again, that they meant him. It happened more than once. Daeho found it very funny. The GCA assembly voted in the month after the Veil Accord. The result was formal, recorded and historic in a way that most historic things are, and important in the record books and slightly unreal to the people actually living through it. Junho was appointed humanity's first GCA senior science envoy. It was not an honorary title. It was a working seat, a real position with real access, real responsibilities, and a real vote in the scientific councils that shaped how the GCA responded to biological and environmental crises across explored space. No human had ever held it before. The ceremony was short and practical in the Veth tradition, which Junho appreciated. There were no long speeches. There was no parade. A document was signed, a title was recorded, and afterward everyone went back to work. Junho liked this very much. He shook hands, or the alien equivalent of it, with Commander Riva, who had recommended him for the role in her report. She pressed 2 fingers briefly to his shoulder, on which in Veth custom was a gesture reserved for people who had done something that changed the direction of things. He walked back to his temporary office, sat down, and started reading the backlog of science requests that had arrived in the past week. Daeho did not accept the low-key approach. He threw a party at a restaurant in the city, a real one, with food Junho could name, and music he recognized, and people who laughed too loudly and stayed too late. Junho went. He sat at the center table and ate rice and listened to Daeho give a speech that was mostly about Daeho's own heroism during the Veil mission, which everyone accepted as fiction and nobody corrected because it was entertaining. Junho stayed exactly 1 hour and 20 minutes. Then he thanked everyone, hugged Daeho, and went home to read. Daeho called him 20 minutes later. "You left. I stayed over an hour. You ate rice and then you left. I also said goodbye to everyone." A pause. Then Daeho sighed, the long sigh of a man who had been Junho's friend for 15 years and had made peace with certain truths. "You're impossible," he said, but warmly. "I have 3 research requests I need to review before tomorrow," Junho said. "You just saved 14 star systems. And now there are other ones that need attention." Daeho hung up. He called back 4 minutes later to say goodnight. Junho smiled and said goodnight. 3 floors across the city, in a high-floor apartment that faced the Han River, Yura sat in front of her work screen and did not work. She had been staring at the same briefing document for 40 minutes. The words were in front of her, but they had stopped meaning anything some time ago, replaced by the steady noise of something she could not quite identify. Something uncomfortable, like a thought she was trying not to finish thinking. The GCA news feed was running quietly on the second screen. She had turned the volume down, but not off. The broadcast was showing footage from the Vale Accord announcement. There was a clip of Junho walking out of the GCA assembly building, not looking at cameras, not raising a hand, just walking with his research bag on his shoulder the same way he had always walked, like someone who had a lot of thinking to do. She had seen the name Junho every day for the past 3 weeks, in briefings, in news reports, some in messages from colleagues who attached his papers and wrote, "You have to read this." She had seen his name in a GCA cultural report that her own office had prepared. She had read 2 sentences of one of his Helix 9 papers before she stopped, not because it was uninteresting, but because it was very interesting, and she did not want to sit with that. Somi was her closest colleague. They had worked in the same diplomatic unit for 2 years. Somi was quieter than Yura but watched more, and Yura had always known this without minding it. What she minded slightly was that Somi was also very honest when she decided to be. The morning after Junho's appointment was announced, Yura looked at it. "Did you know him?" Yura looked at it. "Did you know him?" Somi asked. "We worked in the same division. Years ago." "Were you close?" Yura picked up her coffee. No," she said. Somi looked at her in a way that meant she was choosing not to say something. She sat down and opened her own work and said nothing else, which was somehow worse. Yura had not been sleeping well. She told herself it was the workload. The GCA, post-Vial diplomatic restructuring, had created an enormous amount of work for the Cultural Liaison Unit, and she had been putting in long hours for weeks. This was true. It was also true that when she finally did sleep, one had said what he said. Simply directly had said what he said, simply directly without making a performance of it. The way she had looked at him and seen someone small and ordinary and going nowhere. She was a careful person. She had always been a careful person. She did not like being wrong. More specifically, she did not like evidence of being wrong. Elder from the Vale Accord. A Veth commander from the Vale Accord. A Veth commander who had fought 2 wars and never lost, looking at a human with something that was not just respect, but something deeper than that. Yura turned off the news feed. She finished the briefing document she had been staring at. She sent 3 replies to waiting messages. Then she sat in the quiet of her apartment and let herself finish the thought she had been trying not to finish. He had told her she was wrong about him in the quiet way that people tell you things they know to be true. He had not argued. He had not begged. He had simply walked away and gone to work. And she had watched from a careful distance over 5 years as every single thing she had said about him turned out to be exactly backwards. She did not tell Somi this. She did not tell anyone. But she opened a new message window and she typed a request to the GCA Summit scheduling office. A request for a seat at the upcoming Earth Liaison Summit. She had already been assigned one. She simply confirmed it. In 1 month, Junho would be there, in the same building, in the same halls. She needed to say something. She was not yet sure what, but she knew she needed to say it. Watch the GCA Earth Liaison Summit was held in Seoul on a week in late autumn when the city was cool and clear, and the Han River caught the light in a way that made everything look a little more important than it was. The summit building was large and modern in the way that buildings built for alien guests tended to be. Wide corridors, high ceilings, surfaces that could be adjusted for different species' visual needs. There were Veth officials in the East Wing, Adoran representatives in the Central Hall, and somewhere in the West Corridor, a Selen cultural advisor who had brought a personal environmental unit because the building's climate was not to his species' preference. Every human official had been briefed 3 times on customs and protocols. Nobody wanted to cause an incident. Junho arrived on the first morning in a plain dark jacket in his research bag, which he still carried everywhere. A junior coordinator had suggested he might want to consider something more formal for the summit's opening session. Junho had thanked him politely and kept the bag. He had 3 sessions on the official schedule, 2 bilateral meetings with GCA Science Council members, and 1 off-record consultation with Commander Riva, who was attending the summit as a military observer. He also had, at some point on the second day, a slot of unscheduled time in the early evening. He had not planned anything for it. He was going to read. He did not see Yura on the first day. This was not unusual. The summit was large and the delegations moved through different wings at different times. He had not been looking for her. He had not thought much about the fact that she would be there, which was not entirely true but was what he told himself. On the second evening, a message arrived on his summit communicator. It was from Yura. It was very short. Audi had asked if he had time for a brief meeting, private if possible. She understood if he was too busy. He read it twice. He thought about it for a moment. Not a long moment, but an honest one. The way he gave everything an honest moment. He typed back, "I have time." Where? She suggested a small room on the east side of the building that faced the river. The kind of room that was used for informal consultations and had chairs and a low table and a window. He said fine. He was there first. He stood at the window and looked at the river. The last of the evening light was sitting on the water, and the city across the bank was beginning to show its lights. He put his research bag on one of the chairs and stood with his hands in his pockets, and thought about nothing in particular, which was the way he usually prepared for things. He heard the door open and then close. He turned around. Yura looked the same. That was the first thing he noticed. And then, almost immediately, he noticed that she did not. The surface was the same, composed, controlled, dressed well, carrying herself with the straight-backed precision she had always had. But underneath that, visible to anyone who had spent years watching her without her knowing it, something was different. Something was less certain. She was holding herself together very carefully, the way people hold things together when they are not sure how much longer they can. She stopped a few steps into the room. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "Of course," he said. A silence. Not an uncomfortable one exactly. More like the silence before something that needs to be said is said. She did not sit down. She stood in the middle of the room with her hands together in front of her, and she looked at him the way she had not let herself look at him in a long time. Directly, honestly, without the careful screen of professional distance. She began to talk. She said she had watched everything. She said she had told herself in the early years that his work was interesting but unusual, a single lucky finding. Then she had said it was a good outcome but not something that could be repeated. Then she had stopped saying anything to herself at all and had simply watched as the evidence accumulated into something she could not look away from. She told him she had been wrong about his work. She said it plainly, not as a professional assessment, but as a personal one. He had not been doing ordinary work. He had been doing the kind of work that happens when someone understands something deeply and cares about it truly. And those two things together had produced something that no amount of logic or training or ambition alone could have produced. She paused. She looked at the window for a moment. When she looked back at him, something in her expression had shifted. Something quieter and more difficult had come to the surface. Well, felt things and did not hide that he felt things, and did not hide that he felt them, was not weakness. She had spent 5 years surrounded by people who were good at appearing strong, and she had mistaken the appearance for the thing itself. And then she had watched a human being climb into a small probe and go alone into something the size of a star system, and come out the other side having talked it into stopping, having apologized to it, and she had understood finally that she had made a very significant mistake in her understanding of what strength was. She stopped talking. She pressed her lips together once. Then she said the thing she had come to say. "I was wrong. About all of it. About you. I'm sorry." The room was quiet. Junho looked at her for a moment. He did not look triumphant. He did not look cold. He looked like a man who was listening fully and thinking carefully, which was always how he looked. But there was something underneath it now that was different from simply processing information. He said, "I know." She waited. He walked slowly to the chair where his bag was sitting, and he leaned against the table next to it. And he was quiet for a few seconds. Not the silence of someone thinking about what to say, but the silence of someone who is making sure they say the right thing. He told her he had thought about that hallway. Not obsessively, not bitterly, but he had thought about it. He said there had been a time in the first months on Helix 9 when he had gone over her words and felt the sting of them. Not the rejection itself, but the specific way she had seen him. Small, ordinary, going nowhere. How, he said, that feeling had faded, the way most feelings fade when you give them something better to do, and what replaced it was simply the work. But he said he wanted her to know he had heard her, all those years ago, and the hearing had mattered. He told her he forgave her. He said it the way he said everything, without ceremony, without making her earn it, simply and directly. But then he looked at her and said, it would with the same quiet honesty he had always had. She should know that he was not the same man who had stood in that hallway. He was not the man who had been moved by being chosen. He was not waiting to be picked up. He had built something in those 5 years, not to impress her or anyone. And the man who had built it was different from the one who had stood there with a cup of coffee and said he liked her. He did not say this unkindly. It was dark now, full of city lights. He was dark now, full of city lights. He said, but I'm not closed to the idea of finding out who we are now. He looked at her. She had been very still during all of this. Now something in her chest shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know what to look for. But there. She nodded once. It was a small and honest nod. And he picked up his research bag. Tomorrow evening, I'm free after 7, he said. If you want to talk more, or not talk, either is fine. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on it. I'm glad you said it, Yura, he said. It was the right thing to do. Then he opened the door and walked out into the bright hallway. She stood in the quiet room for a long moment. The river light moved on the window. Somewhere down the corridor, she could hear the ordinary noise of the summit continuing. She breathed out slowly. It was the first time in weeks that it felt like enough air. The GCA assembly hall on the orbital station was not built for humans. This was not a slight. It was simply a fact of engineering. The hall had been designed by Veth architects in the early days of the Alliance, built to accommodate the sensory needs of 17 species, none of which were human. The ceilings were very high. The light was a cool blue-white that made everything feel underwater. And the seats were shaped for species whose bodies were not built like human bodies, so Junho sat slightly forward with his feet flat on the floor and his research bag tucked under the seat in front of him, in the way a person adjusts to chairs that were not made for them without making a fuss about it. He was the first human ever to deliver an address to the full GCA assembly as a peer. Not as a representative of a lesser member species, not as a guest, as a peer, with a seat, a vote, weighing in the same floor time as any other council member. The hall held several hundred attendees across 3 observation tiers. Representatives from 22 species, diplomats, commanders, scientists, cultural advisors. Commander Riva was seated in the front row of the first tier, hands resting on the arms of her chair, posture completely straight. Prat, the Doran scientist who had objected to Junho's involvement in the Viel crisis, was 2 rows behind her, where he had not said another word about the matter since the Accord. He was here now, which said something. Daiho was in the upper gallery, leaning forward with his arms on the railing, grinning the grin of a man who had been waiting a long time for something and was finally watching it happen. Yura was in the diplomatic section. She had her notes open on the tablet in her lap. She was not reading them. Junho walked to the address platform. He put his notes down. A single page, handwritten. Began things, simply. He said he wanted to begin things simply. He said he wanted to talk about what humans were, not what they had achieved, not their history or their biology or their place in the galactic record, what they actually were. He said humans were inconvenient. A quiet ripple went through the hall. He continued. He said humans were inconvenient because they felt things too much and too openly, and this made the species around them uncomfortable. Humans cried at the deaths of creatures they had never met. Humans formed attachments to objects and places and ideas that had no survival value. Humans changed their minds based on how they felt, not just on what the data said. Humans stayed up all night with problems they could have set aside. Humans apologized, and they meant it, which was somehow the most inconvenient thing of all. He said he understood why these things had been classified as weaknesses. In a galaxy built on logic and calculation and the careful management of resources, Everything about the human emotional system looked like a malfunction, like noise in the signal, like an error that the species had simply never gotten around to correcting. He paused. He said, "But we have been running this error for 200,000 years, and it has never once slowed us down." The hall was very still. He talked about grief. He said grief was not a malfunction. Grief was the proof that something had mattered, in a species that could feel that something had mattered, even something it had never personally touched, even a vast organism drifting through space in a pain it could not name, was a species that could do something no logic system could do. It could be heard by things that did not speak. It decided to stop, which was different, and decided to stop, which was different, and was often much later. He said this was not irrational, it was a different kind of calculation, one that included the weight of wanting something, the cost of giving up, the meaning attached to the outcome beyond the outcome itself. He talked about empathy. He said it was not sentiment. Why? It was the most advanced form of pattern recognition that existed. The ability to model the internal state of another being accurately enough to respond to what it actually needed rather than what it appeared to need. He said the Veth AI systems were brilliant. He said the Doran computational models were extraordinary. He said none of them had looked at the veil bloom and understood in 11 minutes and without a single data point from inside it what it needed to hear. He did not say this to diminish anyone. He said it because it was true and because truth stated plainly was the only kind of truth worth stating. He said, "We are not the strongest species in this alliance. We are not the oldest. We are not the most logical or the most precise or the most efficient." He looked out at the hall. "But when something is suffering and no one knows how to help it, you will find a human already trying. You will find a human who has been trying for hours and has not slept and will not stop until they have either found an answer or run out of ways to look. And you will find that human feeling it, all of it, the whole weight of it, because that is how we know which direction to go." He paused for a long moment. "That is not a flaw," he said. "That is the whole point." He picked up his single page of notes, folded it once, and put it in his jacket pocket. "Thank you," he said. He stepped back from the platform. For a moment, the hall held the particular silence that large spaces hold when something has settled into them, something that will not be easily moved. Then Commander Riva pressed two fingers to her shoulder. Around the hall, slowly, other representatives followed in their own species' gesture of acknowledgement. The Doran touched their outer arms. The Selen dimmed and brightened their bioluminescent markings. Prat sat very still, and then he nodded once, a slow and deliberate nod that no one near him missed. In the upper gallery, Deho uncrossed his arms, brought his hands together, and clapped, loudly, alone, the sound ringing through the hall the way only a single pair of hands can in a room full of silence. A few of the human diplomats in the lower section joined him. Daiho kept going until he decided he was done. Yura did not clap. She sat very still, with the tablet in her lap and her eyes on the empty platform where Junho had been standing, and she thought about a hallway 5 years ago and a man who had carried his research bag and said what he meant and did not argue when she turned him away. She thought about everything she had said that day. She thought about everything she now understood that day to have been. She thought about the evening before and a room with a river view. I'm a man who had said, "I forgive you, and I'm not closed to finding out" in the same breath, and meant both of them entirely. After the session, she found him in the wide corridor outside the assembly hall. He was talking quietly with Deho, who was still visibly pleased with himself. When she approached, Deho looked at her, then at Junho, and then said he had just remembered something he needed to do somewhere else, in which was transparently false and which he delivered with no embarrassment whatsoever. Then he walked away whistling. Junho looked at her. She held out a small folded piece of paper. Real paper, which she had found in the summit's administrative office specifically for this purpose, because she had wanted it to be a human gesture and not a message on a screen. He took it. He unfolded it. He read it. It had her contact details, home channel, her personal line, and one line beneath them. "I'd like to find out too." He read it twice, then he folded it carefully, the same fold she had used, and placed it in his jacket pocket, the same pocket that held his notes. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was close to one. The expression of a man who has been patient for a long time and has arrived somewhere he did not rush to reach. "I'll call you," he said. She nodded. He picked up his research bag. He walked down the corridor toward the viewport at the end. A long window that looked out at the Earth hanging in space below them, blue and impossibly clear, wrapped in the thin, bright line of its atmosphere. He stood there for a while. An older Veth scientist stopped beside him. Not someone he knew well, just a colleague who happened to be passing and paused at the same view. The scientist looked out at the planet for a moment and then said quietly, is almost to himself, "Do you ever wonder if your species is truly ready for all of this?" Junho looked at the Earth. He looked at the curve of it, the color of it, the way it sat in the dark with no apology for being exactly what it was. "No," he said. He thought about a small probe going into something the size of a star system. He thought about 3 years on a cold station with a flickering light. He thought about a hallway and a closed elevator door, and the words, "Then I'll give her a reason to be wrong." He thought about 11 minutes of silence and a tear-streaked face and the words, "I told it we were sorry. I meant it." He thought about a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket. "We were always ready," he said. "Everyone else just wasn't ready for us." The Veth scientist said nothing. He looked at the Earth for a moment longer. Then he walked on. Ao Junio stayed at the window a little longer, alone with the blue planet below and the dark around it, and the quiet and certain feeling of a man who knows exactly who he is and is not finished yet.